Welcome to Module 4's presentation, a little bit about crafting introductions. We're going to be talking about introductions today because one of your assignments around this time in the class is to produce an introductory paragraph and then get feedback on that paragraph from classmates about how to improve it. So today we're just going to talk about a few of the reasons why people struggle with introductions and some ways that you can make your introductions better and stronger. There are a lot of different reasons why students seem to struggle with introductions, and it's a very common thing for students to struggle with introductions. One problem people face is that if it's the very first thing a writer's doing in an essay, which often it is, it can feel difficult just to get started. A lot of students struggle with writer's block, and writer's block can really kick in at the beginning of the essay writing process, particularly because the introduction is one of the most difficult types of paragraphs to write. So if it's difficult already and you're doing it first, sometimes writer's block can kick in. Also, people can feel lots of pressure when writing introductions because it's the first paragraph in an essay, so it really does need to be done well to grab the reader's attention, and so there can be some pressure there. Also, it's a difficult question of how can you encapsulate the ideas of an entire essay into just a few sentences that can kind of summarize your project, what you're going to be doing. All of these are reasons why people struggle with introductions. However, there are ways to minimize introduction struggles. One way is to pre-write. Can't say this enough, pre-write, pre-write, pre-write. The more you prepare before you start writing that introduction, the easier it's going to be to get your ideas down on paper because you've already organized your thoughts. Often if a student starts writing an introductory paragraph without having pre-written, then the ideas just kind of come flowing out and get all mixed up, and it can come out sounding very muddied and confused. Another way to minimize introduction struggles is if you're having trouble during the drafting stage with writing a good intro paragraph and that's kind of holding you up or stressing you out, it's okay to just write down just this thesis sentence and move on to the rest of the paper. Unless you have a specific assignment like the one we're going to do in this class where you have to turn in the introductory paragraph. If you're just in the drafting stage for any essay, there's no reason why you have to completely finish the introductory paragraph before moving on to the rest of the paper. And sometimes that can be a really helpful tool or technique, is to just figure out a thesis statement, write the rest of the paper, then come back and finish writing the introduction once you've written the rest of the paper. A lot of times that can also have the effect of making the introduction a lot more clear. So to write a great introduction, there are various things that you should be doing, and we're going to talk through those in some detail today. The first one is a great introduction should grab the reader's attention. To write a great introduction, you should craft a clear and strong thesis statement, and you should avoid generalizations. Grabbing the reader's attention is important, and a lot of students are taught this in lower school, that one of the tasks of the intro is to be an attention grabber, is what they say. And there are lots of different ways to get the reader's attention. These include, but they're not limited to, just some of them are asking a question. Asking a rhetorical question in the introduction can get the reader thinking, provoke thought. Beginning with a quote, a lot of students like to do that. That can be a way to get the reader's attention, though one caution with choosing a quote is that if you're going to begin with a quote, the quote should be well chosen. It should be pertinent, right? It should go along with the idea of your essay. It shouldn't feel tangential or like you picked it just kind of as a stretch. So it needs to be the right quote, but if you've done it correctly, beginning with a quote can grab the reader's attention. Setting up a contrast can be a really great way to grab the reader's attention. If you're going to be arguing in favor of a particular policy, for example, one way to grab the reader's attention would be to point out its opposite, right? The effects that could be had by the opposite policy or by a lack of policy. So that if you can set up a situation where you're pointing out some negatives and then make a contrast with the thing that you're trying to plug as positive, right? Setting up a contrast can also grab the reader's attention. You can also do this by making a comparison. You can grab the reader's attention by comparing something that you wish to discuss with something else, something the reader might find even more familiar or might already be thinking of as positive. So making a comparison can also work. There are a few things you should not do in the introduction paragraph that can render it very ineffective. One of these is do not throw in ideas that will never appear later in the paper. This happens all the time. Students will put things that sound really interesting in the introduction paragraph as a way to grab the reader's attention, but then we'll never reference those ideas in the rest of the paper. The problem with that is that that's very unclear and confusing. The reader then expects to hear more about those ideas, and when it doesn't appear, it leaves the reader in confusion. Do not begin with a dictionary definition unless it's actually a definition essay. If it's a definition essay, like we'll do in essay 4, that's fine, because that's the whole point. But if it's not a definition essay, I would caution you against beginning with a dictionary definition, simply because it's been done so much, it's kind of a cliche to start with a dictionary definition. One final thing is in the introduction to not do is do not make outrageous and or combative statements to provoke the reader. Sometimes students will make really kind of outlandish claims or outrageous statements, or use a tone that's really more aggressive than the student probably intends to be using as a way to grab the reader's attention. The problem with that is that it will grab the reader's attention, but in a negative way, and that's not what you want. You want the reader to be trusting you as a writer from the beginning of the paper, and if you begin with that kind of antagonistic tone, that's not going to work. It's just going to make the reader react with defensiveness. So that's another thing to not do. So there are several ways to craft a good thesis statement. That's the second thing you should be doing in your intro paragraph. The first thing would be to grab the reader's attention. Second thing is to craft a good thesis statement. And one of the first things that you can do to craft a good thesis statement is to know the difference between an implicit thesis and an explicit thesis. These are the two types of thesis statements. And we're talking about this right now because your book doesn't really go into detail about this. I'm not even sure if it uses those terms. So an implicit thesis is defined as a thesis in which the topic of the essay and your opinion about the topic is stated more generally or implied without listing specifics. So one example is the one here on the slide. A child's autism diagnosis can impact a family in a variety of ways. Okay, that's very general. It's kind of implied. We don't know what the variety is necessarily or what is meant by the word impact. An explicit thesis, by contrast, is when the topic and the writer's opinion are stated clearly, including specific items that will be discussed in the essay later. So an example of one like that would be this: a child's autism diagnosis can impact a family negatively in the areas of emotional stress, budgeting, and scheduling. Okay, so this is a different version of the previous thesis that puts in some more specific language and gives a list which shows exactly what's going to be talked about. And I want to stress that one of these is not better than the other. The implicit thesis is not necessarily weaker or problematic because it's not as specific. It's just a different kind of thesis. It doesn't provide the super specific roadmap of the rest of the paper the way that the explicit thesis would do. I would say that if you are new to writing and if you're at all nervous about crafting thesis statements, I would go for an explicit thesis because it's a little bit clearer and easier to construct, and it gives you a better sense of where you need to go in the rest of the paper. Other ways to craft a good thesis statement. Number 2, make sure your thesis statement tells not just the topic, but also your opinion about that topic. So, a good thesis statement doesn't just say, I'm going to talk about autism, but instead gives an opinion about something like that, as in the previous ones, about a diagnosis and the effects that it can have. Your book calls it, when you just state the topic and not the opinion, your book calls it an announcement, says it's an announcement, and I like that it's an announcement, it's not an opinion. Number 3, make sure that your thesis statement gives an accurate roadmap of what will come in the essay. This is particularly true if you do an explicit thesis with a list. If you give a list, then you need to make sure that the body paragraphs appear in that exact order as they are listed in the thesis. Because if you don't do that, it can cause a lot of confusion for the reader. And this happens all the time. Students will have a thesis that lists ideas 1, 2, and 3, but then the body paragraphs in the body of the essay instead are ordered 2, 1, 3. Or something like that, and there's a mismatch between the order in the thesis and the order in the body, and that's confusing. It's a unity problem. So make sure that the thesis statement, which is supposed to be giving it a roadmap for the paper, make sure that that roadmap is accurate. Number 4 of the ways to craft a good thesis statement is don't clone your thesis. What I mean by clone your thesis is sometimes in a student's paper there will be an introductory paragraph that contains 4 different sentences, all of which say very similar things about the same topic, and any of them could be the thesis, because they all kind of sound like thesis statements and they are all very similar. That's what I mean by cloning the thesis. It should be clear which sentence in the introduction is the thesis. And if it's not clear because there are several very similar sounding sentences, then you've cloned your thesis, and that's a bad idea. It makes it difficult for the reader to tell which is meant to be the thesis. So don't do that. And number 5, and this can also help to point out which is the thesis, you need to position your thesis statement correctly. Your thesis statement should be the last sentence in the introduction, not the first sentence of the essay. Some students get confused and put it as the first sentence in the essay, or some will put it midway through the introduction paragraph or something like that. But the thesis should always be the last sentence in your introduction paragraph so that the reader knows where to find it, and that for maximum clarity. Also because you want your thesis statement fresh in the reader's mind moving into the body paragraphs. And if you place it right at the front of the introduction paragraph, then by the time the person finishes reading that paragraph, it's already been forgotten. Okay, our last point on how to craft a good introduction paragraph is to avoid generalizations. Often students think they should start on a big scale before they move to a more specific narrow thesis. The problem with this is it can lead to ridiculous generalizations, like saying things like throughout history or throughout time. Well, hardly anything has been true throughout history and throughout time. Or people will say things like in society or across the country or across the world, as if all people are the same in all of the societies or throughout the world or across the whole country. Those are kind of scales, geographical scale mistakes or generalizations. And also their students can make generalizations about people's opinions by saying things like everyone agrees that this is true, or it's evident that this is true, kind of lumping together whole people groups and acting as if they all believe the same thing. These are all generalizations. And they're a bad idea because it makes it look like you are making assumptions about whole groups or places. So the way to fix this, or to not do this, is to reject generalizations and get specific from the beginning of the paper. There's no need to start on a massive scale before scaling down to your more specific thesis. It's okay to be specific from the beginning. And keep in mind too that generalizations they're boring for readers and unmemorable because they're not specific. It's hard to hold in our minds information that's not specific. They also weaken your argument because they make it look like you have not properly considered the issue with nuance. So just to review, when writing introductions, you want to make sure that you grab the reader's attention, you craft a clear thesis statement, and you avoid generalizations. If you can do these 3 things, you're well on your way to writing a great introductory paragraph.